Jamal Carter stood in that courtroom, sweat trickling down his back as his heart hammered like a drum in his chest. The judge, Raymond Holt, leaned back in his chair, throwing his head back with a laugh that reverberated off the cold, sterile walls of the courtroom. It wasn't just any laugh. It was a laugh that cut through Jamal like a knife. The entire room seemed to echo with it. The smirks from the all-white jury, the snickers from the attorneys, and that horrible sound, the sound of a man who thought he had won. Jamal's brother, Darius, was sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but no one cared. Not the judge, not the jury. The moment that gavel hit the wood, it wasn't just Darius's fate that was sealed, it was Jamal's too. A 16-year-old kid, alone in the middle of a broken system, with nothing but the weight of his brother's wrongful conviction on his shoulders. The world had turned its back on them. And as the courtroom erupted into laughter, Jamal swore something in him snapped. He couldn't just sit there and let this happen. This wasn't just about his brother anymore. It was about justice. It was about fighting back. It was about proving that even if the system tried to bury him, he would stand tall and tear it down piece by piece. He had no idea how, but he knew this. He wouldn't let Judge Holt have the last laugh. This was only the beginning. That night, as Jamal lay in his small bedroom, the echoes of the trial replayed in his mind over and over, like a constant drumbeat that wouldn't stop. His brother Darius was locked away in a concrete box far from home, a place where no one would ever hear his cries, and Jamal couldn't do anything about it. Or so he thought. He tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling, the crushing weight of the injustice pressing down on him. But as the night dragged on, something inside him hardened. He couldn't let that be the end of the story. He'd been quiet his whole life, doing the right thing, staying in the background, studying in the library while other kids were out playing ball or hanging out. But that moment in court had ignited something inside him, a fire he couldn't ignore. He could feel it burning in his chest, pushing him forward. Jamal wasn't just a kid anymore. He was a weapon, and he had just discovered his power. It wasn't his fists or his strength, it was his mind. His photographic memory, his ability to remember every detail he ever read or heard, was his weapon, and Jamal was about to turn it into a full-blown war machine. By morning, Jamal was already sitting at the kitchen table, the dim light of dawn creeping through the windows as he sifted through Darius's case files. His mother's old chipped mug of cold coffee sat beside him, forgotten, as he scanned every detail, every scrap of paper. The evidence didn't add up. Darius's trial had been a joke. There were mistakes in the testimony, key pieces of evidence that had been ignored, and an attorney who had barely put up a fight. Jamal's eyes narrowed as he read the police report again. It all started to click. Darius was accused of robbing a gas station, but the timestamps didn't match up. The witness who identified him was shaky at best. There were holes in the story, huge gaps in logic. Jamal knew what he had to do. He couldn't sit back and wait for someone else to fix this. He had to act, and he had to act fast. The public defender's office had failed Darius. Now Jamal was going to pick up the pieces. He couldn't afford to let this slip through his fingers. His brother's life was on the line. He'd spent countless hours poring over legal books, memorizing every statute, every case. Now it was time to use that knowledge. By midday, Jamal had already drafted an appeal. He was shaking, his hands trembling as he typed, but he was focused. He wasn't going to let this slip. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he wrote out his arguments, citing ineffective counsel, procedural errors, and new evidence that could clear his brother's name. He wasn't just going to sit back and watch the system swallow his brother whole. He was going to fight back no matter what. It was his turn now, and Jamal Carter was about to show the world that a 16-year-old kid could take on a system that was stacked against him. Jamal didn't waste a second. By the time the sun was setting, he had printed the appeal, the pages crisp and neat, ready to be filed. He didn't have the luxury of waiting around. He had learned enough over the years to know that nothing would be handed to him. He needed to be relentless. He knew the system. He knew it was flawed, rigged against people like him, people like his brother. But Jamal also knew that the law was his weapon, and he wasn't going to let it be used against him. He pulled on his wrinkled suit, the one he had worn to the trial, and walked 3 blocks to the courthouse. The building loomed ahead, dark and imposing, like a fortress built to crush anyone who dared to stand against it. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the scent of bureaucracy. Jamal approached the clerk's desk, a woman with pinched lips and a sour expression. She barely looked up when he slid the envelope toward her. "I'm filing for an appeal," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "Darius Carter's case number 7629. The woman glanced at him, her eyes raking over his wrinkled suit and scuffed shoes. "Boy, you can't just walk in here with that mess. You a lawyer?" She sneered. Jamal's heart sank, but he didn't back down. "I'm his brother. I have the right to file," he said, keeping his voice calm. "You're required to accept this, Mom. Refusing to accept it is a violation of my due process rights." Her face flushed with anger as she grabbed the envelope and tossed it aside. "We don't take trash from kids like you. Get a real lawyer or get out." Jamal didn't budge. "You're breaking the law," he said, his voice cold and calm, even though his blood was boiling. "I'll report you to the state bar." But the woman just scoffed, her lips curling into a sneer. "Go ahead, boy. Nobody cares." Jamal knew he had to stay focused. They were trying to shut him down. They were trying to bury him under their contempt, but he wasn't backing down. He had already read the rules. He knew his rights, and they had no choice but to take his appeal. He just had to stand his ground. His fists clenched at his sides as he stood there, unmoving. It wasn't just the system that was rigged against him. It was the people within it. But Jamal Carter wasn't going to let anyone walk all over him anymore. He was done being silenced. He was done being overlooked. He was ready to fight, and he wasn't stopping until his brother's name was cleared. Jamal's heart was hammering in his chest when he received the call. The words, "emergency hearing," hung in the air like a threat, and his stomach twisted with the knowledge that Judge Holt was about to take another swing. He grabbed his notes, threw them into his bag, and pulled on the wrinkled suit again, the one that had become a symbol of everything he was fighting against. As he stepped out of his front door, the humid air clung to his skin, but Jamal's mind was 1,000 miles away, focused on the battle ahead. The courthouse was only 3 blocks away, but it felt like a world apart. The walls of the old building loomed over him as he approached, as if it were a fortress built to crush anyone who dared challenge it. He walked through the doors, the cold air inside doing nothing to calm the fire burning inside him. The courtroom was half full when he entered, mostly reporters and Holt's loyalists, people who were all too comfortable in their cushy seats of power. Darius wasn't there. He was still miles away in the prison, locked up, forgotten by a system that didn't care about him or anyone like him. Jamal could feel his brother's absence like a weight on his shoulders as he stood at the podium, eyes locked on Judge Holt's cold stare. Jamal knew this would be no easy fight. Holt was the king of this courtroom, a man who had ruled with an iron fist for over 20 years. But Jamal wasn't intimidated, not anymore. As Judge Holt entered, the room seemed to shrink, the air thick with his presence. Holt was a giant, 6'4", broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut that made his stone-cold face look even more menacing. He swept into the room with all the grace of a vulture circling its prey, robes billowing behind him. His eyes locked onto Jamal like a predator sizing up its next victim. "Mr. Carter." Holt's voice was thick with disdain. Like every word he said was coated with venom. "You're wasting my time. Explain this foolishness before I lock you up for disrespect." The courtroom erupted into laughter. It was like a sick game to them. Jamal stood tall, despite the tremble in his knees, despite the weight of the room pressing down on him. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'm filing an appeal for my brother, Darius Carter. The trial was flawed. His counsel failed him, and I have new evidence proving he wasn't even at the scene of the crime. I have proof, Your Honor." Jamal's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Holt seemed to freeze. The mocking laughter from the gallery died down, and Jamal saw a flicker of something in Holt's eyes, surprise, maybe, or anger. But it wasn't enough to stop him. Holt leaned forward in his seat, a twisted grin curling on his lips as he scrutinized Jamal like he was about to strike. "You sound like a scared little boy playing lawyer," Holt sneered. "This ain't no school play. Sit down before you get yourself in trouble." The laughter came again, louder this time, and Jamal felt the sting of every mocking word. But he didn't falter. His jaw clenched, his fists curled into tight balls by his sides, but his voice didn't crack. "I'm not backing down, Your Honor," Jamal said, forcing every word out through gritted teeth. "I've got the law on my side. Section 32 of the State Code gives me the right to file an appeal. And I've found a mistake in the transcript. Page 17, line 42. The prosecution's closing argument went over the time limit. It's right here." He flipped open his notebook, pointing to the line he had circled in red ink. "The trial was flawed, Your Honor. You have to grant a retrial." For a moment, there was silence. The room held its breath as Judge Holt snatched the transcript out of Jamal's hands, his eyes scanning the page with a furrowed brow. The room waited for Holt's verdict, but Jamal knew this was the turning point. If he could just hold his ground, if he could make the judge see that he couldn't be ignored, he might just win this battle. He pressed on. "The law says any overrun in time invalidates the closing argument. You can't just ignore the rules, Your Honor. You've got to grant a retrial." Holt's expression shifted, just for a moment. His lips tightened, and his eyes flashed with something that looked like fury. But he slammed the transcript down onto the bench with a crack that echoed through the room. "Fine," he growled. "Retrial granted. But don't think you've won anything, boy." He banged the gavel down with such force that it sent a jolt through Jamal's chest. The sound of the gavel echoed in his mind like the sound of a gunshot, a signal that the fight was far from over. Jamal gathered his papers, his legs weak under him, but his chest swelled with something close to victory. He had done it. He had cracked the wall. Holt had been forced to grant the retrial. His brother had a chance now. The reporters were already scribbling furiously, their phones buzzing with the story of the young black teen who had forced the racist judge's hand. Jamal couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his lips as he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the world on his shoulders lifting, if only for a moment. But that smile faded quickly when he saw Judge Holt through the courtroom door. Holt was still sitting at his bench, his face twisted in anger, muttering into his phone. His eyes flicked toward Jamal, and the hatred in them sent a chill down Jamal's spine. "Handle the kid," Holt growled into the receiver before slamming the phone down. Jamal's stomach dropped. He had won a battle, but Holt wasn't finished. This wasn't over, and he knew whatever was coming next would be far worse. He could feel it in his bones. Holt had already set his sights on him, and Jamal knew he couldn't rest, not until his brother was free. The fight had only just begun. By the time Jamal made it home, the weight of the trial was beginning to sink in. It had been a victory, but a fragile one. The retrial was only the first step, and Jamal knew that even with the evidence on his side, the road ahead would be anything but easy. He sat at his kitchen table, the case files spread out before him once again. The papers were a mess, stained with coffee and dog-eared from countless hours of reading. But Jamal didn't mind the chaos. He thrived in it. This was his moment to shine, to use everything he had learned over the years to fight for Darius. But as he sifted through the documents, his mind kept drifting back to Judge Holt's smirk, the way the judge had dismissed him so easily, as if he were just a kid playing at being a lawyer. That laugh still echoed in his mind, and it only fueled his desire to make Holt regret underestimating him. Jamal couldn't afford to get comfortable. He had a real chance to save his brother, but the road ahead was treacherous. The legal system wasn't built to work for someone like him, and Jamal knew that if he wasn't careful, he could easily get swept under. The system was rigged, and he had to be smarter than everyone else to beat it. So, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jamal made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to rest until Darius was free, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't care. He would fight, and he would win. Jamal was shaking as he walked to the courthouse the next morning. The betrayal he had just experienced from Tom Grayson, the lawyer he thought would help him, still stung. He had trusted Grayson, believed that he was a friend, an ally in this fight, but it had all been a lie. Grayson had sold him out, twisted the evidence Jamal had carefully prepared, and turned it against him. The worst part was the way he had done it so casually, as if Jamal's fight, his brother's life, was just a game to him. Jamal's stomach churned as he thought about it. He had always known that the legal system wasn't built for people like him, people from his neighborhood, people who were seen as disposable. But this was betrayal on a level he hadn't anticipated. He had given everything for Darius, every ounce of energy, every waking moment, and now it felt like it had all been for nothing. He didn't have much time to dwell on it, though. He couldn't afford to. The hearing was in just a few hours, and he still needed to come up with a way to salvage the case. If he didn't find a way to prove his brother's innocence, everything would fall apart. He could already hear the whispers from the courthouse staff, the smug looks from the clerks, the way they would treat him now that he had been branded a liar. He had been set up, and no one was going to care. They never did, but Jamal wasn't going to let that happen. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let this court, or anyone in it, walk all over him. He had already proven once that he could hold his own against the system, and today he would do it again. The courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, cold and imposing, its stone walls mocking anyone who dared to challenge it. He could feel the weight of history in every step he took toward the door, the weight of every person who had ever been wronged in this very building. But Jamal wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He had nothing left to lose. As he entered the courthouse, his eyes locked onto the clerk's desk, the same desk where he had been humiliated just days before. Doris wasn't there this time. Instead, a younger man with slicked back hair and a smirk that could make anyone's blood boil was sitting behind the counter. Jamal didn't waste any time. He placed the envelope with his new evidence down in front of the man. "I'm filing to submit new evidence for Darius Carter's retrial," he said, his voice steady. The clerk barely glanced at the papers. He twirled a pen between his fingers and chuckled. "Another one, huh? You really think this is going to work, kid?" Jamal clenched his jaw. He knew the game they were playing. They didn't think he belonged here. They didn't think someone like him could actually be a threat. But Jamal wasn't backing down. He knew the law better than they did. He wasn't just some kid off the streets. He was the one who had found the holes in Darius's case, the one who had figured out how to bring it all down. He had the truth, and no one could take that away from him. "I've got a right to file," Jamal said, his voice unwavering. "You're required by law to accept this." The clerk scoffed, looking him up and down like Jamal didn't belong in the courthouse. "Yeah, sure, kid," he said, tossing the envelope onto a pile of other papers. "We'll get to it." But Jamal wasn't done. He knew what they were doing. They were trying to delay him, trying to make him feel small, trying to make him give up. But Jamal wasn't going anywhere. "That's a violation of my due process rights," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're required to accept this, and if you don't, I'll report you to the State Bar for refusal of legal documents." The clerk's face went red, but before he could respond, another man, balding with a lazy eye, wandered over. "What's this nonsense?" he mumbled, snatching the papers out of Jamal's hands. He glanced at them for a moment, then threw his head back and laughed. "Well, well, well. Some black kid thinks he's Perry Mason. How cute!" Jamal's blood boiled. His fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not playing," he said coldly. "I'm doing this for my brother. This is real, and you're breaking the law." The man's smirk faded as he dropped the papers into a bin. "Yeah, sure, kid. Whatever you say. Just don't waste anyone's time, all right?" Jamal didn't budge. He knew that they were trying to make him quit. They wanted him to back down. They wanted to see him crumble under the weight of their indifference. But he wasn't going to. Not this time. He was already in too deep. His brother's freedom was on the line, and he wasn't about to let them get away with this. He knew he had to keep pushing, no matter how many doors they slammed in his face, no matter how many times they tried to break him. He would not be silenced. The call came later that afternoon. Judge Holt had summoned Jamal to court for an emergency hearing. Jamal's heart leapt in his chest. This was it, his one shot. He had to be ready. He had to be perfect. He couldn't afford to mess this up. He grabbed his notes, his case files, and headed straight back to the courthouse, each step carrying the weight of his brother's future. The courtroom was packed when Jamal arrived, the tension thick in the air. The reporters were buzzing with anticipation. They knew something big was about to happen. Jamal stood at the back of the room, his eyes trained on the bench where Judge Holt sat, looking every bit the tyrant he was. The judge's cold, calculating eyes swept over the room before they landed on Jamal. Holt's gaze didn't flicker, didn't show any hint of respect or recognition. To him, Jamal was just another challenge to crush. "Mr. Carter," Holt said, his voice low and dripping with disdain, "you're back again. Tell me, what foolishness is this? What are you trying to pull now?" Jamal stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for. This was where he would show Holt and the world that he wasn't some scared kid anymore. He wasn't going to let this corrupt system continue to destroy lives. "Your Honor," Jamal began, his voice steady but fierce, "I'm here to submit new evidence for Darius Carter's retrial. The case was flawed from the start. The evidence was mishandled. The witness testimony was unreliable. And now we have proof that Darius wasn't even at the scene of the crime." Jamal laid the evidence on the table, pointing to the photo from Darius's phone, showing him at the barbershop 3 miles away when the robbery occurred. "This is the truth, Your Honor," Jamal said, locking eyes with Holt. "This is the evidence that will set my brother free." Holt's eyes narrowed as he scanned the photo. For a moment, Jamal saw something flicker in the judge's eyes, something that looked like uncertainty. But Holt quickly masked it with his usual smug expression. "You think this changes anything, boy?" Holt sneered. "This is nothing. This is just a weak attempt to get a retrial. You think you can outsmart me?" Jamal stood his ground. "I don't need to outsmart you, Your Honor. I just need to show the truth." Holt slammed the gavel down with such force it echoed through the room. "Retrial granted," he said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "But don't think you've won. This isn't over." The sound of the gavel was like a bullet through the silence, and Jamal knew this was just the beginning. Jamal's legs nearly gave out as he left the courtroom. He had done it. He had forced Judge Holt's hand. His brother had a chance now. But even as the victory settled in, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was just a small win in a much bigger fight. Holt wasn't going to go down without a fight. He knew that now more than ever. As Jamal stepped into the hallway, the reporters' cameras flashed, their questions coming at him from every direction, but he barely heard them. He was already thinking about the next step, the next move in this chess game, with a man who had the power to destroy him. Jamal had cracked the door open, but Holt was still a force to be reckoned with, and Jamal knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Jamal's mind raced as he walked back to his apartment, the weight of everything that had just happened threatening to crash down on him. Judge Holt had granted the retrial, but that victory felt hollow. He knew the fight was far from over. The judge's smirk, the way he'd dismissed Jamal as a mere child playing at being a lawyer, it lingered in Jamal's mind like a poison. It wasn't just that he'd won a battle, it was that Holt had let him win for now, only to set up an even bigger fight down the road. Holt didn't just hold power in the courtroom, he controlled everything. He had connections that ran deep, ties to people who could make Jamal's life even harder. Jamal's thoughts turned to his brother, locked away in that cold prison, a place where no one would care about Darius's innocence. Jamal wasn't naive. He knew that Darius's freedom wasn't guaranteed by a judge's gavel. It would be secured by the truth. But getting the truth to the people who mattered, the ones who could change Darius's life, that was where the real fight would happen. The retrial was a step in the right direction, But Jamal knew that every step forward would come with 10 steps back. It was a fight for survival, for justice. He had no illusions about the battle ahead. As Jamal entered his apartment, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, her face tired and drawn. She hadn't asked him about the trial yet, but the concern in her eyes said everything. "How did it go?" she asked softly, as though afraid of the answer. Jamal didn't have the heart to tell her the whole truth, not yet, not until he had more answers. "We've got the retrial," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're one step closer, Mom. Darius has a chance now." His mother didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Jamal knew she was grateful for the progress, but the weight of the uncertainty was too heavy for any celebration. She knew better than anyone how corrupt the system could be. It wasn't about what was fair, it was about what the system decided to let slide. Jamal went to his room, where Darius's case files lay scattered across the floor, and he sat down to pore over them again. Every document, every scrap of paper was a clue, but something had changed. He wasn't just reading the case now, he was reading the law, trying to see the system for what it was. He had learned to play by its rules, but now he needed to outsmart it, to use it against itself. The system was built to crush people like him. Jamal knew that. But it was also built with cracks, flaws he could exploit. He just had to find them. The phone call came late that night, shattering the silence in his room. His heart skipped when he saw the name on the screen, Lena, the woman who had been a beacon of support for him through this entire nightmare. "Jamal," she said, her voice urgent and strained, "you need to get to the courthouse, now." Jamal's blood ran cold. What had happened? Had something gone wrong? His pulse quickened as he grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. Lena's words kept repeating in his head, but he couldn't make sense of them. The courthouse, that towering symbol of everything he was fighting against, loomed ahead once again as he made his way through the dark streets. The moment he stepped into the courthouse lobby, the tension hit him like a wall. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. The air felt suffocating, like it was filled with whispers of secrets and threats just waiting to surface. He made his way through the building, avoiding the familiar eyes of the staff who had watched him stumble through the halls for days now. He didn't care about them. He didn't care about anything except getting to the truth. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew it wasn't going to be good. When Jamal entered the courtroom, he was met with a sight he hadn't expected. There, at the center of it all, was Judge Holt, sitting high above everyone else, a smug look plastered on his face. It was as if he knew something Jamal didn't. The room was packed, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, a hum of excitement filling the air. Jamal's eyes narrowed as he scanned the faces of the crowd, looking for anyone who might give him a clue as to what was happening. He stepped forward to the podium, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Holt's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, Jamal saw something different in the judge's gaze. It wasn't just the usual contempt, it was something darker, more dangerous. Holt was toying with him, playing a game that Jamal hadn't figured out yet. Jamal's stomach churned as Holt's voice boomed through the room. "Mr. Carter," Holt drawled, the mockery in his tone unmistakable, "I trust you're here to tell me how you plan to waste more of my time today." Jamal's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't let the judge see his anger. "Your Honor," he began, his voice firm despite the fear that threatened to seep through, "I'm here to submit new evidence. The case was mishandled from the start. The new evidence—" Holt interrupted, his voice cutting through Jamal's words like a blade. "Enough of this nonsense, Carter," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Do you think this is some game? Do you think you're the first person to try and play the system? You're wasting my time, and you're wasting everyone else's. You'll never win." The venom in Holt's voice was unmistakable, and Jamal could feel the weight of those words pressed down on him. It was clear that Holt wasn't going to make this easy, but Jamal had come too far to turn back now. He had to push forward, no matter how much Holt tried to scare him. Jamal took a deep breath and steadied his nerves. "Your Honor, The evidence I'm presenting is irrefutable. Darius Carter was not at the scene of the crime. The testimony was false, and the prosecution's case was built on lies. I have proof." Jamal slammed the file onto the podium, pulling out the photo from Darius's phone, the timestamp showing him 3 miles away at the barber shop when the robbery occurred. The room fell silent, the reporters watching closely, the tension palpable. Holt's face twisted in anger as he grabbed the file, scanning the photo with an expression that only grew darker as he realized the significance of it. "This doesn't change anything," Holt spat, slamming the file back onto the podium. "This is a joke, a pathetic attempt to derail justice." Jamal's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady, his eyes never leaving Holt's. "The law is clear, Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Section 32 of the State Code says that new evidence must be accepted if it proves that the original conviction was flawed. This is that evidence." Holt's face contorted with rage. "You don't get to tell me what the law says, boy," he sneered, standing up from his bench. "I've been running this courtroom for 20 years, and you think you can waltz in here and teach me about justice? You think you can just walk in and undo what's been done?" The laughter from the gallery echoed around Jamal, but this time he didn't flinch. He was beyond that. He had already come too far to let it end here. "I'm not walking away, Your Honor," Jamal said, his voice a low growl. "I've been studying this case. I know the law better than you think, and I know my brother didn't do this. You're going to grant the retrial, and you're going to let him go free, or you're going to answer for it." The room fell deathly silent, every eye locked on Jamal. Holt's face flushed purple with rage. For a moment, Jamal thought he might throw the gavel again, but instead, Holt's face twisted into something more dangerous, pure, unfiltered hatred. "Retrial granted," Holt said, his voice strained with fury. "But don't think for a second that this is over. You'll regret this, Carter." The gavel slammed down, but this time it wasn't a victory, it was a warning. Jamal knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. The fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Jamal allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. He had done it. The battle had just begun, but this time the odds were on his side.